Welcome everyone to another episode of the Shaman's Way podcast. As always, this episode comes from the teachings of our amazing friend and shaman in residence, Kriket. We hope you're enjoying these podcasts as much as we enjoy making them, and I'd like to take just a moment to ask you if you would please leave us a rating and a comment in iTunes or whichever podcast player you're listening to us from. Giving us a rating and sharing this podcast with others is the biggest way you can tell us that you like our show. Now, without further ado, on with the episode.
Well, hello to my constant listeners and hello to my semi-constant listeners, and a very warm welcome and hello to my brand new listener. This podcast is a follow-up to the one I released 2 weeks ago called Dying Alone. I was inspired to do journey work with respect to the weight or the change in a soul when a soul dies during a particular pandemic or a long-term death. This is a follow-up to that. For this journey, I used 2 of the tracks that you can find on Shaman's Way. The first track that I used was the multiple drumming track, which is approximately a half an hour long, followed by the rattle track. What I generally do when I'm in the journey state, when I hear the call back, is I take my spirit and I put it a little bit lower into the lower world if that's where I am, or a little bit higher into the upper world if that's where I am. I wait for the call back to finish, and then as soon as the next track comes on, then I pop up and continue with the journey. I had very different experiences with the drum journey, followed without the callback by the rattles. The rattles shook the world differently. The tension and the deep reasoning realized in the drumming journey released with the sound of the rattle. And the rattle was cleansing like rain, shaking out of my awareness darker colors, heavier energy, but bringing me to see some very real and horrific deaths. I felt the drum held my spirit longer in the lower world, while the immediate shift to the rattle brought me to the middle world. The middle world parts of the journey brought into sight horrible deaths and a deeper insight into the inequality of death. I was not taken to rich persons' deaths. Instead, I was taken to a brothel where a woman was thrown onto the street. I was taken to a slum. My sight was darkened. Small feet ran past me, and a gunshot flew by me. Using different tools, possibly even combined, can bring us different visions and insights. It can shift the energy around you as well as deeply held within you. I visited one of my own deaths in these journeys, afraid, alone, in pain, delirious, lost. And obviously my soul found its way back because here I am. That was one of the questions that I postulated in the last time we met together, was what is the effect of dying in delirium and being lost? And I did talk about the souls that I encountered, not only during psychopomp work, but also during depossession work. I talked about how I was under the impression, and still am, that the entire reality of we choose everything, including our own death. While I think to a large extent that has an absolute possibility, it would behoove us to remember that chaos still can be the ruler of the universe at times, and our very own universe. When I entered into this journey, I was swept into a very dark cloud. My initial reaction was fear, and I turned myself into as small a ball as I possibly could. Then I remembered that I could shapeshift. I shapeshifted into a ball of light and traveled above the clouds, shifted back into the form of my journey self. I floated above while moving along with the cloud of death. I wanted to see what it was like to die alone during a pandemic. So many scenes flashed around me at that time. Sometimes it was challenging to focus. I was asking the question, what happens when we die alone? And I ended up asking that question in many different ways, almost as many ways as I could possibly think of. My spirits took me into the timelines. I saw much worse death pandemics than the ones we're currently facing. I asked how the souls cross over under the weight of such fear. Fear and death, they reminded me, were an old married couple. Whether the fear was created by those around the dying, along with the dying person, or just the person dying themselves. They took me to many sites of mass graves, long plowed under and built upon. I did find out quite quickly how ill-informed I was about the history of pandemics. To gain clarity, I sought out death herself. I was greeted by the many faces of death. Death as angels, Lady Death, along with the faces of death I have never met before. A group of the faces of death were kind enough to invite me to sit at a table and listen to their tales. Death allies. They introduced me to their many allies. Death allies was a term I had never really thought of. I never really thought that death would need allies. This was a bit of a surprise for me. In retrospect, I certainly can understand and can certainly see how death has allies. I don't want to continue on into a tangent, but I thought, oh, look, even after all these years, look. Anyway, constantly learning, that's all I'm saying. The first ally that I saw was rats. From rats came fleas. Come fleas, my vision went to even smaller, to microbes. I was given images of microbes in mold, microbes in algae, microbes as a virus. The allies of death come and came in many different sizes. I was reminded simply, death is impersonal. The spirits of death are not after each of us personally. We are simply a part of the path that they walk upon. I remembered when I journeyed to Gaia after the tsunami in 2004. She certainly couldn't understand the fuss over a few dead people. She was merely stretching her feet, and voila, an earthquake. And we know how that stretch ended close to 230,000 lives. When I explored the different ways that the allies had worked with the spirit of death, when they showed me the spirit of mold, I thought about how many times that we have died due to using moldy wheat, to having death coming from unclean food, from microbes in water that we have drank before we had a water purification system. Even recognizing that water could carry contagions was something, I don't know exactly when other people discovered it, but there is a time when typhoid fever was coming. It was a person who was trying to think of how this typhoid fever was coming about, used a map, and in using the map was able to trace that it was coming from one particular well, because there were people in this particular part of the city who were getting typhoid fever quicker than anywhere else. They were able to trace that to the water. These are things I wasn't aware of, or if I was aware of, I certainly wasn't aware of consciously until I went into the journey. When I went into the journey, the spirits took me to many different variations of types of death, variations of long-term death or the weight of death. In asking the question, what happens when we die alone, there were many opportunities for me to experience visually and energetically different types of death that has come about through the span of humankind. After being schooled by the many faces of death, I was returned to the sites of dying. During the different plagues I encountered, the same 3 traveling companions to this virus traveled along. They were fear, paranoia, and panic. I was also reminded of fear, when I peered even further into the emotions, I encountered shame, judgment, and curses. I did not expect any of those. I didn't expect to encounter shame in the process of death. Judgment, I could understand because I have certainly done enough psychopomp work around suicide and death that comes as a means of self-infliction or inflicted by another human being, and there are many ways to die with shame upon the soul, that's for certain. Think of your own, I'm certain. Judgment was very interesting to me. I hadn't really encountered judgment in that regard. I hadn't encountered the disdain and distaste in the mind of the persons who were responsible for saying prayers. I encountered priests who had said prayers over mass graves for people who had died. This was the Black Plague. It looked like it was in the 1300s. I know there are a few plagues, but that was one of the big ones. When I saw that, it was being communicated to me that those people who died of the plague were considered to be dirty. They were also considered to be smote or killed by God or ravaged by the gods, or the gods had angered them and killed them. And I hadn't really considered, as I said, the weight of judgment. The curses that were placed upon the people who died, generally of things that they were not responsible for. No one could be responsible for catching the plague. No one could be responsible for catching smallpox. No one could be responsible for catching the H2N2 and then the H1N1 and the various types of ways that we've died. But the curses, I curse you for leaving me behind. I curse you for the emotions, like I said again, of the fear, the paranoia, the panic, and the anger, that I certainly expected because I had encountered in my previous journeys. Shame came in many forms. Shame to have caught the dirty disease, shame to have slighted the gods, shame to have invited the wrath. The burying of the dead were influenced by the same prejudices and ignorance, condemning some of those to linger by their graves, believing they were not worthy of a peaceful afterlife, carrying the weight of the unknown and the unseen, cursing the poor and the fringes of society to catch whatever death was walking with, eliminating the fringes of a town or a city, the undesirables. Spirit even took me to an island with lepers, and although leprosy is not a quick death, it is that cursed death. It is the judged death. It is the death of admonishment. It is the death of banishment. That was another way of the long-term death, and how many years had this particular camp for lepers survived, and how many times in history did they have places for the banished people to try to eke out some sort of existence. And they encouraged me to look at the weight of their souls. They encouraged me to look at the weight of dying in that community, that type of a death, that death sentence death. When the rattles came, this is when I was taken to modern Venezuela, and they showed me the faces of the forgotten and the cursed today, the deaths that will never be recorded, the prostitutes, the orphans, the poorest, malnourished, unrecorded, the undocumented. Death comes as an answer to the prayers, said and not said. Death comes to collect the thrown away more gently than I've ever witnessed. That was also a gift in the journey, was to see how death took care of the people who were the most abandoned. And they were carried very gently by the spirits of death that I witnessed. They were carried to the place where they were supposed to be in a gentler perspective or in a gentler way than I had seen. Of course, there were some that were lost. There were some that abandoned. There were some that couldn't move past the curse of their death or the curse of their illness, obviously. But those that did receive death, death came gently as a gentle spirit to pick them up and take them wherever they needed to go. When I was taken to the United States again, I asked, what about dying alone with a ceiling of worry and a fear? And again, death laughed at me and chided me for my ignorance. Death asked me what I thought about the fear in Rwanda during the killing spree of the Tutsis in 1994. We briefly touched that fear hung so heavily during those several months, during which time I remember there was between 500,000 to 1 million humans who were shot, hacked, and mauled to death. And when I went there, I could taste the fear. Rwanda had impacted me, but I hadn't thought about it in these terms. I remember when it happened. I remember being appalled at witnessing such horrific forms of violence of human against human, and realizing that it certainly wasn't the first time, and it will never be the last time. Depending on where my spirits took me in the U.S., I would encounter different emotions. Fear was certainly one of them. What surprised me was resentment. Resentment from the living on behalf of their family member who died giving their life for the lives of others who had survived. Anger at the hopeless of having little or no choice to be present and working. I am certain we can all come up with different emotions circulating around us. I visited meatpacking plants and met with the spirits of workers who had died. Anger at the lack of choice, the lack of caring, the lack of compassion. One soul summed it up for me by saying this: "We were forced to work so others would eat. My family, what will they eat now? Poverty is what they will continue to eat. I was disposable, having no value except a butcher." How do you argue with that? What salve do I have for that soul? What salve do I have for the wounded who are still in the grips of this death? What salve do I have when I encounter the souls who resent having to be out there? When I journeyed to some of the hardest hit hospitals, the waves of fatigue that buried me were like nothing I had ever experienced. The amazement of just sitting outside the hospital. I mentioned in my last podcast how I really am uncomfortable going into hospitals, and for what reason. I did not feel called to go into the hospital. I felt called more to witness the emotions, to witness the chaos, to witness all of the said and unsaid, or as much as I could take in, certainly not all of it. So the said and the unsaid emotions, thoughts, ideas, and the fear that the people had going into work, not just for the people who were sick, but the fear for the people that they would come home to. Why do they have to move into their jobs when some of us have the ability to stay at home? Lack of choice, lack of caring, lack of compassion. That's quite astounding, very heavy. How we die, how we honor the dead, all have influence on the journey after death. Dying alone, I ask again. I was also reminded of how I felt when I visited Cambodia. I was reminded there were holy men and women who had taken on the responsibility for the souls of the dead. Indeed, I had witnessed such sights and felt the energy when visiting particularly heavy sites. There was a certain tree, I can't remember the name of the tree, that was left in the compound where many prisoners were held and were killed. The heaviness of that was, I could see, lifted somewhat by the trees, but the trees were that perpetual filter for the air, for the spirits. So the spirits of the dead could come to this tree, could move through this tree. This tree had the energy to move the souls dead. I liken it in a way, because I don't know the full extent of the tradition of leaving that tree and all of the history with it. I'm not from Cambodia. But in my room, in my healing room, I've talked about before the soul catcher stone, and how the soul catcher stone has that energy to it, the ability to pick up and to move things. So I know that we have tools, and we've had tools for many years to help the souls of the dead cross over. Depending on where the spirits took me into the U.S., I would encounter different emotions. Fear was one of them. I spent time outside of senior centers. Many emotions surrounded the worst hit places. I was not surprised to feel relief. Lingering in the body for every type of reason felt tiring. I was touched by the spirits who gathered around some of the centers where the elderly had died in mass numbers. Around those places were the anger from the loved ones who could not see them, fatigue from the constant caregivers, hopelessness, but relief, very much so from some of them. A very elderly lady, she was 91, she said she was 91. She's the one who told me about relief. I could feel relief. And she came up to me and I said, what did it feel like to die alone in your room? And she said, oh, honey, I wasn't alone. I said, well, what do you mean? And then she went on to describe some of the images that she had in and out of her delirium. I said it must have been a very horrible death. And indeed, it had been a horrible death, but fortunately for her, she had had good medication. I wondered at that point if she didn't have help crossing over a little bit quicker, then perhaps her body would have expired. If so, blessings for the caregiver who was compassionate enough. And she was the one who spoke about relief, how many years she had lingered in that home, how many years she had lingered with a low quality of life, and that her time was relief. I didn't see relief on every face that was coming out of the old age homes by any stretch of the imagination. There was a lot of anger, there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of loneliness, there really was. But to see hope in amongst all of that, or the gratitude for dying at a point where you didn't know when death was going to come, like the 91-year-old, she was waiting, simply waiting, but her body would not let her go. I didn't question further as to what it was she felt that she had to finish, because I don't really think, one, that's any of my business, and two, I'm not always certain that that is the case, even though I know that there are many of you who have worked in hospice, have very strong, amazing experiences. I'm just sharing with you my own thoughts and my own experiences. Value. What is the value of one human life over the cost of another? Dying alone, I asked again. And the only reason you're asking this question is because you have a global eye. Yes, that's very true. 2.5 billion people watching this. Of course I'm asking this question because I have a global eye. Well, Spirit has always had a global eye, it reminds me. This is when I felt I was being toyed with. So I sought out Lady Death. I was tired of the banter of the dead spirits, and the spirits chastising me and bitch slapping me for not remembering this and not knowing that. And so finally I got tired and I said, oh, to hell with this. Together, Lady Death and I, we traveled to the bubble over North America. We saw the psychic trauma. I was questioning the psychic trauma. We heard the prayers of thousands of voices, more voices than I heard praying after 9/11. She showed me some of the places in the bubble where there were stuck souls, like a balloon stuck to the ceiling after a wedding. I carefully cut into the bubble, floated back, and watched as quietly and with no fanfare souls escaped, traveling to wherever their place of sojourn happened to be. I have been chastised before, certainly been put in my place on more than one occasion. Learning the lessons of death does certainly have its drawbacks, and I've certainly had my share of drawbacks in working with death and working with the spirits that help to procure death. Death was more than willing to share with me the impact it has on the history of our souls, not just on the history discussed. We have died alone many times. This may be my first pandemic consciously, but it wasn't death's. Fear has been entwined with death since we began to contemplate the separation of our soul from that which is. We incorporate rituals to send our soul along, but dying without an honor or celebration of the soul does have its consequences. Dying alone in a pandemic does have consequences. Souls can be trapped by our fear. by their fear. Souls can be trapped when the living are so tightly focused on their own survival. They fought to hold tighter to what they have lost and what they could lose, even tighter, yet to the possibility of living longer. Interesting conundrum. Of course, we're going to pray to live longer when those around us are dying. Or maybe we're going to pray to die along with those of us who are dying, because we can't imagine life without this person or that person. How we die, how we honor the dead, how to bury the dead, all have an influence on the journey after death. Death was very confident we would survive this. However, it is unlikely death would not seek another ally to aid in its work. Some people have mused it may be nature's attempt to thin the herd. My thought after traveling with death, if nature did want to get personal and kill us all off, it would have created a far deadlier ally. I have to admit to you, especially to you, my constant listener, I was dumbfounded that when I was mental meandering through massive deaths, I completely blanked on the plagues. I pictured many minds wondering, hey, when is she going to mention the plague? What about the Black Plague? Hello, Kriket, the bubonic plague. Think about it. Half of Europe's population was gone. Sometimes I can be so monocular that I forget to lift my head up and look around or look deeper than just the Spanish flu. So my constant listener, thank you for your patience, waiting for me to wake up to the, what's the word I'm looking for? You're going to say the obvious? The obvious. I have to admit that it does make me laugh now, but it certainly didn't make me laugh when I realized it afterwards. Anyhow. During our souls' lives, we have died and survived different mass deaths and tragedies. We have died in mass numbers over a long span of time, traveling to the plagues of Europe, smallpox in Japan, and the weaponized smallpox in North America. I felt deepened by my understanding of how the weight of the fear of death does have a long-term effect. Souls don't always move along gracefully. Like I said, this shit's messy. Death can be messy. Sometimes the humans charged with the task of creating ceremony for our souls can carry heavy judgments, affecting our journey into the afterlife and into the life after death regrouping. There are many ways to contemplate death. There are many ways to contemplate how we move through our death. I don't know how long this particular pandemic is going to last. I do know that there are many things that we will never see. There are many things we will never know, simply because there are the unrecorded. There are those who are not cared about. And that has always been and likely always will be. This is how we live. This is the progression of our soul. This is the evolution of our soul. When we move into the life after death, regrouping before rebirth, we have an opportunity to gather ourselves. Perhaps we can also recognize when we encounter a spirit of the dead in the lower world, the upper world, the middle world, wherever you're going to encounter it, doesn't always mean that the person you encounter in a dead form is the entirety of that person. There are soul pieces that are left in previous lives. There are soul pieces that have been left in other experiences, and that does affect us in this lifetime. I do think we have the opportunity in our exploration of death to explore how we die, whether or not we can die a good death, whether or not we are going to be strong enough and capable enough to cross over at our time. We can contemplate these things. We can do journeys into the past to pick up pieces that we've left along the way. We can journey to the experiences that created fear for us. We can journey to the things that affect us. We can heal ourselves. We can bring more of ourselves home. When we pass this lifetime, we pass more whole than we did last lifetime. And if we die more whole, then our hope is that when we birth again, if we live again, that we come into that life with more knowledge, with more understanding, with a deeper connection to self and to soul. This is the hope anyway. Until next time, I am always grateful for your time. I am always grateful for you listening. I hope that these are interesting conversations for you, and I know if they are not, I will hear from you, and I know if they are, I will hear from you. Until next time, Sionata. Blessings.
Thank you again for joining us here on the Shaman's Way podcast. If you have any questions, would like to make a request for a future episode, or if you're looking for other shamanic resources, including free drumming tracks, please visit us at shamansway.net. Until the next episode, be well, everyone.